Good evening. I'm sitting down here. If you're looking up at the podium, that person isn't speaking yet. Will in a few moments. I'm just going to introduce her. My name is Sandy Clunas, and I'm happy to serve on the curriculum committee of the Keese School. Diana Partal is a writer, editor, and former journalist, and a 45-year resident of the Washington, D.C. area. During her career, she worked for a range of publications, including the National Geographic and the Washington Post, and for several major science organizations in Washington and in Southeast Asia. Her reporting on education, science, medical research, history, and cultural topics has appeared in many print and online outlets. We're in tonight for a treat about recovery and discovery. When you start in one topic and go down a side road and find an even better scenery, which is what happened to Diana. She revived a hidden, mysterious contributor to women's literature in Washington, D.C., and I'm anxious to hear more about it. May I introduce Diana Partal.
Thank you, everyone. You can hear okay? Great. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. I love talking about this topic because I know it is one of the favorite things about everybody who lives here in Washington. We are so privileged to have these cherry trees, which first came to Washington in 1912. So over the years, there have been quite a number of stories reported about the origin of those trees. It's not always been accurate. As I discovered when I set out and discovered this topic, there is a lot of misinformation out there over the years, but there are a few things people typically know about the trees. They say, well, they were a gift from Japan. People kind of know that First Lady Helen Taft had something to do with it. And people often know that there was a fiasco and that the first batch of trees that was sent were unfortunately found to be infested and had to be destroyed. So those are a number of things that are true about the cherry tree origin, but one thing that has not been known over the years is how that idea began. And so what I'm going to talk about tonight is the subject of my book published 2 years ago, which tells for the first time the story of this woman who was really the linchpin behind that idea. She is the first one to ever propose planting cherry trees in Washington. It took her 25 years to see that happen. So I'm going to talk to you tonight about her story, how I discovered her, and then I'm also going to give you the real story of the cherry trees and how that whole process came about. So if she was so important, why have we never heard of her? Well, and how did I discover her? How did I come to write her story? That of itself is an interesting story because I found out about her not here in Washington, D.C., where she lived for much of her life, but in Southeast Asia, of all places. So I was living in Indonesia about 20 years ago with my husband on a job assignment. I bought this paperback book, Java, the Garden of the East. It was a paperback reprint of a book that was published in 1897, a travelogue of Java. So I bought that book. I carried it home with me. A few years later, I picked it up off my shelf. I dipped into it for the first time, and I was totally engrossed. I thought it was a great little book. It was very informative. It was very descriptive, and I loved the voice of the author. So I said, who was this guy, E.R. Sidmore? What took him out to Java 100 years ago? And when I went online, there was a very short Wikipedia entry that told me the author was an American woman named Eliza Ruhamah Sidmore. Well, that of itself was interesting, but it got even better. It said she was a travel writer who wrote books on Alaska, Japan, Java, China, India. It told me that she was the first woman ever elected to the board of National Geographic Society in 1892. Then the kicker, I read that she is credited as the first person to introduce the idea of bringing Japanese cherry trees to Washington. I was stunned because I had lived by then in Washington for some 30 years. I went to see those trees almost every year, like many of us do. I had never heard this woman's name. So I was totally intrigued. It was a point in my life when I had some extra time, so I went down to the Library of Congress just to see what I could find out. That turned into what became 7 years of research to uncover her story. So when I got to the library, I didn't find out much. I found copies of her books, original copies. I found her listed in a couple dozen biographical indexes, which told me she was a very important person in her day. But there wasn't much about her personal life at all, just a handful of articles that she had published. Well, I started digging just to see what I could find out. So I started with her books, her book on Alaska. That took me deeper into the story. Then I just started connecting some dots, and a couple years into the research, I had a huge breakthrough. Because I had been searching the databases at the Library of Congress for her name, Sidmore. And it was giving me a sample of her writings, but it was only after I discovered she published a lot of her early work under a pseudonym. Her middle name, Ruhama, which was the name of her grandmother, and it was a biblical name. It was her middle name. She used that as her pen name. A lot of people in that era used pen names, including male reporters as well as female. Once I found that distinctive pen name, I plugged it in to the databases of historical newspapers and magazines. I ended up finding almost 800 newspaper and magazine articles this woman had published in her day. So this is 100 years ago. Well, this was shocking. So suddenly, I was able to begin to put together a chronology of her life, because if you know anything about datelines in newspapers, they will tell you when and where that author was traveling. So for the first time, I was able to construct a timeline of her life. Then that's when my research really took off. So I found, one of the things I found was a family history that had been published by a very distant cousin of hers out in Illinois. So that turned out to be a very good beginning because it gave me a lot of her family history. So the things that I learned from that: she was actually born in Iowa right before the Civil War in 1856, but she spent her early years in Madison, Wisconsin. Her uncle was the founder of the Wisconsin Daily Journal there. Her brother, she had two brothers. One was 2 years older, and one was 13 years older from her mother's earlier marriage. That older brother became an apprentice to the uncle. And I was able to find later on that he became the stepping stone to her own career in journalism. Well, an interesting development in her life is her background, her family background, because her mother was married 3 times. One of those was very mysterious. It took me quite a while to track down this history, but the mother I knew was widowed in her first marriage. Second marriage in this family history mentioned that the mother had been married, and it said, well, the husband must have died within a year because, that's in the records. Well, when I'm doing the research, I'm finding this guy's name, which was a bit unusual, showing up in the West. It took me about 3 years to discover that middle marriage was a divorce in about 1848. Well, then Mrs. Sidmore married for a third time to the man who became Eliza's father, But things didn't work out there either, because during the middle of the Civil War, her parents separated. I was not able to find out why, but during the Civil War, around 1862, for some reason, the father went west. He joined a cavalry unit. I found evidence that he spent the rest of his life in the West. Mrs. Sidmore took her two young children, Eliza, who was 5, and her brother George, who was 7, came to Washington, D.C. So she did this in part, I think, in order to be able to support the family. There were a lot of jobs at Washington at the time because of the Civil War. They needed, they needed housing, they needed food, they needed all kinds of support people in Washington. So her mother came to Washington and started taking in boarders. She worked as a boarding house matron. I couldn't tell whether she owned the boarding house or she was she worked for somebody, but for many, many years, she ran a boarding house. So Eliza and her brother George grew up in a boarding house environment. Also, Mrs. Sidmore took a job eventually working for the Treasury Department, which was one of the first agencies in the city to hire women because all the men were off in the war. So young Eliza was clearly a precocious child. She attended Georgetown Georgetown Visitation. It was a convent school. She attended that for the first 2 years of her life, or her schooling rather. And I found her academic records for 2 of those years. And at the end of first grade, she was awarded 2 prizes. One of them was sort of in orthography, which is kind of the rules of spelling. The other one was in geography. She told an interviewer later in life that as a child, her passion was playing with maps and a globe. My favorite thing, she said, was making up journeys. My daydreams were always of other countries. This was a very important find when I discovered this in an interview, because this tells us from the very beginning, this is a young girl with a keen curiosity about the world. So she grew up to become a journalist. At the age of 19 in 1876, she actually got her debut reporting on what was then America's first World's Fair. It was the 1876 Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia, held to mark the 100th anniversary of American independence. So she went and she reported on that fair. And you can tell she was a quick study as a journalist, because I found 5 articles that she published in a Washington newspaper the first week of that event. Think of this. There's no Google research. There's no laptop. She had to write those stories out in longhand in her hotel room, send them off by a mail pouch on a train back to her newspaper office in Washington. So that marked the beginning of her 40-year journalistic career. She came back to Washington and she got a job working as a correspondent for a newspaper in St. Louis. So she would file 3 columns a week. She was called a society writer. There were a number of women doing this as freelancers for newspapers, because newspapers were trying to get more women readers. But there was also, if you think about it, this was the Gilded Age in Washington. This is when there was extravagant entertaining, when congressmen were trying to outdo one another in the ostentatiousness. And so a lot of the editors felt they needed women to cover the party scene and the social scene. So there were a surprising number of women who were doing this in Washington. But she didn't cover just parties. She went to receptions at the White House. She covered development in Washington. She went to Capitol Hill and actually followed events in Congress. So she grew up with a pretty strong interest in public affairs and in world affairs. But I've already mentioned she had quite an interest in seeing the world, and so an important event occurred a big milestone in her life in 1883, because she started traveling around the country while she was still working in Washington. She would take a few months off, go off and travel, and file stories for that newspaper. And in 1883, she went to Alaska. This is the ship she traveled on, 1883. Now, at this time, America had only owned Alaska for 16 years. People knew almost nothing about Alaska. They had, there are stories that say people thought that it was a big ice tundra covered in polar bears. Well, she knew that wasn't the truth because she had followed events in Washington. She knew that Alaska was a story that had yet to be told. So she went there in 1883. She was influenced in part by John Muir. Now, before John Muir became noted as a environmentalist and conservationist, he was interested in glaciers. So in the summers of 1879 and 1880, he went to Alaska to check out glaciers. He rented a canoe and traveled around with half a dozen native Alaskans. They paddled 800 miles in that area, including into a bay that had not yet been explored. So they're paddling by canoe, and he comes upon this bay and the first signs of what was later named Muir Glacier, this magnificent glacier. No ships had yet ever gone into this upper northern part of that bay. But he came back, he started lecturing about Alaska, he started writing articles about it. So Eliza is inspired by this. In 1883, a chance occurrence, she goes on this ship. Normally, they leave from Puget Sound. They travel 1,000 miles north up what's called the Inside Passage, and then they would turn around and come south again. These were mail steamers that were contracted to carry the U.S. mail. It was the only way people had to get to and from Alaska. So in this trip in the summer of 1883 that Eliza is on, something unusual happens because the captain takes a detour. They are in the north. He makes a detour because he has some supplies on the ship to deliver to a brand new trading post. That trading post is at the mouth of Glacier Bay. So they get there, and the captain is talking to this trader who has set up this post. He is reporting all that they've heard about this magnificent glacier from Muir and the others. So it's a nice day, it's clear, the icebergs aren't bad. He says, let's go and see if we can get a view of those glaciers. And that's what the ship did. They sailed 30 miles north to the very top edge of Glacier Bay. The first time a ship ever did that, Eliza Sidmore was on board to report on what later became the Muir Glacier. So she wrote about that in her newspaper articles. She went back the following summer, repeated the trip, again as a newspaper reporter, and she turned that into the first travel guide to Alaska. So suddenly, she becomes a celebrated author. Now she is getting pretty well known. She wrote a second book later on Alaska in 1893 that was even more comprehensive than the first. So she went to Alaska about half a dozen times over 15 years. So obviously she's pretty well respected, including by, this is an 1890s photo from Glacier Bay, because her book, her writings, and John Muir's writings were really what sparked the beginning of the Alaska cruise industry. So in 1890s, the ship company started putting excursion ships onto this route. So for the very first time, people are traveling up to Alaska. So it marked the beginning of tourism. So among the people that were really impressed by this were the scientists at the brand new National Geographic Society. It had been founded in 1888 by quite a number of eminent scientists here in Washington. Eliza joined the organization in 1890, and in 1892 they elected her corresponding secretary. That made her the first woman ever elected to a position of such importance in a scientific society, and she became the most important woman in the early history of National Geographic. So she became a contributing writer. She wrote about a dozen articles for them over the next 20 years. She was an associate editor, and she also contributed photographs, both taken by herself and photographs that she tracked down in the course of her travels. So that position at the Geographic really made her a woman of prominence who was a friend and a colleague of people like Alexander Graham Bell and other scientists in Washington. So here is her name on the masthead. So another milestone in her life came 1885, the same year her first Alaska book came out. Right after the book got published in the spring, she and her mother packed their bags and leave for a vacation. They are going to Japan. Why Japan? Because her brother George has joined the consular service and become a consular officer. So he would go on to spend most of his 39-year career in Asia. And most of that time was in Japan. So this is a picture of Yokohama around the time that she arrived. There's her mother and her brother with Eliza. So Yokohama, if you know anything about Japanese history, this is the period when Westerners were beginning to go to Japan for the first time. For 200 years or so, Japan had closed itself off to the outside world. The shoguns or military generals had run the country. They were trying to keep out foreigners because they wanted to preserve their culture. They also wanted to avoid being colonized, which had happened, of course, in their neighbor, China. So for 200 years, very few people went to Japan. There were a few traders, some Chinese, there was some Dutch traders, but for the most part, Westerners had very little knowledge of Japanese culture. And that changed in the 1850s when Commodore Matthew Perry of the U.S. Navy sailed into Edo Bay or Tokyo Bay with a group of ships, guns ready to fire, saying to Japan, you need to open your doors to trade to the outside world. Well, this put the Japanese in quite a dilemma. Were they going to fight back, or were they going to accept the situation? So they had a bit of a civil war in Japan, and what happened is that the shoguns, in the power struggle, the shoguns lost power when it was restored to the emperor. So now the emperor is in charge. He happens to be a young man of very enlightened ideas. He decides that he is going to fight back by making Japan an equal of Western nations. So if you know Japanese history, you know that it is really a phenomenally a real success story in terms of how Japan, in 50 years, turned itself from a feudal society into a major world power. By the end of that century, they brought in Westerners. They adopted all kinds of Western technology, Western forms of government, education. They sent young Japanese men abroad. to study foreign ways. So there's this intercultural exchange happening now where the Japanese are reaching out to the world and Westerners are flocking to Japan because they have been keen to know more about Japan and they were fascinated with Japanese culture. So Eliza goes at a time when there is a huge, huge amount of interest in Japan. So as a reporter, she is reporting on Japan, both the old ways and the new ways. And there is a great deal of interest. So one of her most famous books was called Jinrikisha Days in Japan. Here's her mother, second to the left, in a jinrikisha. The mother decides to move to Japan and live with her son. Well, this gave Eliza a part-time home in Japan. So she started traveling around, writing about the country for many, many major American magazines. And as I mentioned, she turned that into a very, very popular book on Japan. That began a 40-year association with Japan. Now that she had a part-time home in Japan, she came and went often. Here you see her at a temple in Japan. Because of her brother's diplomatic status, she was able to have a bit of mobility and to have access to some places that were really off the beaten track for most other tourists. But she didn't limit her travels in her reporting to Japan. Suddenly, because she now has this base of operations in Japan, she starts traveling all around the region. So we've got Japan. She reports from Korea. She goes up to China and reports. She comes all the way down the coast. She reports on these various trips she makes. She comes down here to Java, which I've already mentioned. She wrote a book, which was really kind of the first guide for tourists to Java. She came over and wrote a book on India. She went over to the Philippines after the Spanish-American War. And I must say that one of the joys of researching her life was to read her journalistic accounts. She did not leave a lot of diaries, but I had two things that were really, really rich sources of information to get her voice. One was, of course, her published articles. The second were letters she wrote to her editors. I found a wonderful, wonderful stash of letters at the New York Public Library that I don't think had really ever been consulted. They were still in a thick manila folder, handwritten. I went to the library in New York and read and transcribed these letters. She is writing to her editor at a magazine in New York called The Century. And in these letters, she's talking about where she's going, what she's seeing, what her plans are. You can see her opinions coming through in these letters. Well, these were a delight to read because of her voice, but also, of course, because they were telling me where she is traveling. And I'm able then to begin to plug all these bits of information together. So I drew very, very heavily in the book on her journalistic accounts and also the letters to various people. So she really then became known as an expert on Japan, but also as a world traveler. So she went in 1900 to Asia to deliver a lecture about Japan. And the guy who introduced her at the Asia Society said, I was going to introduce her as Miss Sidmore of Yokohama, but I'm going to introduce her as Miss Sidmore of everywhere. She was so well known for the extent of her travel. So she really became a widely celebrated author. These are her books. She wrote about a half a dozen books of travel. The last one's interesting. By the way, the third one, Westward to the Far East, she was writing for the Canadian Pacific Railway. I just came back. I was in Vancouver about a month ago on a vacation with my husband. They have a wonderful collection there, the Canadian Pacific Railway. She was a writer for them. She wrote a travel guide for them, and they in turn then subsidized her travel. So this again was an example of how she's got a hand in a lot of pies. She's recycling her material for a lot of different outlets. The last one on this list, As the Hague Ordains, 1907. This is a book that was based, it's a novel, but she wrote it as if it were told from the point of view of the wife of a Russian who is interred at a prisoner of war camp in Japan because Japan went to war with Russia in 1905. And Eliza was in Japan. She was quite interested in this issue because in 1899, they had, at the International Peace Conference, they had just developed the first protocols for prisoners of war, how to treat prisoners of war. So she was quite interested in this issue. This was really the first world war that broke out after those accords were adopted. So she was quite interested in it. She tried to write a magazine article, and she said, well, it's just too complicated. So she wrote it in the form of a novel, as if it were written from the point of view of a Russian woman who came to Japan to administer to her husband while he was in a hospital in a prisoner of war camp. So this became hugely, hugely important book and went through quite a few printings. We're going to now move to the cherry trees because this starts the beginnings of her idea. She, as I've mentioned, is traveling quite regularly in Japan by this time. And one of the things that affected her tremendously was this ritual known as hanami. Now, this is a ritual of flower viewing that has been celebrated for 1,000 years in Japan. It really began kind of as a nature ritual where people would go up into the hills. The cherry trees used to grow wild in the mountainside. People would go into the mountains in the spring when those trees were in bloom, and it was basically a spiritual practice where they are paying homage to the deities that they thought lived in the trees. They would picnic under the trees. So gradually, this became such a practice that people started planting and cultivating cherry trees. So they would create cherry tree parks all over Japan. So by the time Eliza came in the mid-1880s, this was a very well-established ritual. And I want you to look at that and think, doesn't this remind you of Washington, D.C.? So as we get through the story, I really want to stress the idea that her vision was heavily shaped by what she saw in Japan. And we're going to see in the end just how closely the trees that we see today match that vision that she had in mind. So she saw hanami at a number of locations in Japan. This is a woodcut of one that was it was considered one of the most spectacular sites of cherry trees in D.C. It was along the Sumida River in Tokyo, and it was called Mukojima. So this was a woodcut that was published in the 1880s, I think it is, early 1800s. So what you notice along that top, this was a 1 to 2 mile long double row of cherry trees. And the reason I included this slide is that this really had an she was at this Mukojima site. And it influenced her a great deal because several times in her letters and her various writings, I found evidence she refers to creating a Mukojima on the Potomac. So she has a vision. She says Cherry trees are the most beautiful thing in the world. Why don't we have them in America? And what better place than in the nation's capital? So by the 1880s, by the late 1900s, Washington is developing, 1800s, yeah, you know what I mean, 1890s to 1900. Washington is becoming developed. It is gaining a reputation as one of the most beautiful cities in America because they have done a lot of development over the years. And it is especially beautiful in the springtime. So it is becoming a tourist town for the first time. Lots of families, lots of Americans are going to Washington in the springtime because it is such a delightful place. And so Eliza says, why not Washington in the springtime when everybody comes to the nation's capital? So she gets the idea that Washington should have a cherry tree park, and she has a spot in mind. If you look at this upper picture, this is a picture of the Washington Monument still under construction in the 1870s. Now, if you look at that, it's behind that is the Potomac River. But what's interesting here is you can see that the Potomac River comes almost to the base of that Washington Monument. So for many, many years, that area behind the monument was very muddy, marshy area. So the Potomac River, the currents would come downstream. They would carry these deposits that would build up on the shoreline. It created a very marshy, mucky area that was known as the Potomac Flats. So when the river tide came up, it would bring that water almost up to the base of the Washington Monument. And then when it rolled out, when the tide rolled out, it would leave this big muddy field. People complained about it for years. A newspaper article I found in the New York Times referred to it as a swamp. So one of the derivations behind this whole idea of Washington being a swamp. People complained about it because it was smelly. They said it attracted, it created malaria. It was unsightly. So for years, people complained about it. Finally, there was a bad flood. Congress finally allocated the money to have that area of the mall cleaned up. And what they did essentially was they had the Army Corps of Engineers fill in that land. They were dredging the Potomac to deepen the channels for navigation. So they took the deposits and the soil from the bottom of the Potomac. They piled it up on that area behind the Washington Monument, and doing so raised the level of that land to create 700 acres of usable land. Now, the interesting story that I want to talk about is how Eliza Scidmore had already, as a young reporter, been reporting on the construction of the Washington Monument, which wasn't completed until about 1885. I found a letter, or a newspaper column of hers from 1883, right after she came back from her first trip to Alaska. She's a reporter. She's looking for material for one of her newspaper columns. She goes to the top of the Washington Monument when it is still under construction. I found a wonderful picture of the platform elevator that they used to carry the stones, those huge boulders, and the workmen to the top of that monument while it's under construction. She writes in her newspaper column how she rides this to the top. And one of the things she does when she gets to the top of that, which is, as I say, still under construction, she's looking out on that. She's reporting on this brand new project. And she says in that column, one day, this is going to be the largest and the most beautiful public park in Washington, D.C., a place of magnificence for future administrations. Now, the thing that's interesting about this is she had not even gone to Japan yet. She went to Japan 2 years after that. Then when she saw the cherry trees, she put two and two together and said, we are creating this new park in Washington. What better place to create a cherry tree park than in this brand new Potomac Park? So she took this idea to the guys who were building the park. This was the Army Corps of Engineers. They were creating that park. She said to them, you know, you really should add some Japanese cherry trees. They heard her out. They listened to her idea, and then they ignored her. This happened at least 3 times, according to her accounts, in 3 different administrations, that she went to them and tried to get them to add cherry trees, and they resisted. By the turn of the century, about the early 1900s, they had filled that land in. So there you're seeing in the bottom what Potomac Park looked like with a drive. So Eliza wants to add cherry trees. She hasn't been successful. She does find an ally. She finds a couple of allies at the turn of the century, and that is a botanist at the U.S. Department of Agriculture named David Fairchild. He was what was known as a plant explorer. He would travel around the world collecting new specimens or different varieties, different specimens of plants and food crops that really weren't known in America, and he would import them to America in order to diversify the agriculture in America. So on one of his trips to Japan, he discovered cherry blossoms. Now, the story that's interesting is he never actually saw cherry trees in bloom, but he was taken to visit an important horticulturalist who showed him some magnificent watercolors of different cherry blossom varieties, and he was stunned. He said, wow, I want to know more about these. I want to know if we can import these to America. So this is around 1904, 1905. He orders a bunch of cherry trees, plants them at his home in Chevy Chase, where he had an experimental garden, because he wanted to see if they would acclimate to the local climate. And the cherry trees did magnificently. This is his wife. She happens to be the daughter of Alexander Graham Bell. Their cherry trees then became were so magnificent, they invited people to come and see them. They talked the Chevy Chase Civic Association and Development Association to import about 300 trees for the streets of Chevy Chase. These are not, by the way, the Kenwood trees that we know about in Bethesda. Those were added in about 1930s. But suddenly now we have David Fairchild and his wife also petitioning to bring cherry trees to D.C. So they and Eliza suddenly are allies. They both want to bring cherry trees. She wants to create a cherry tree park by the river. He wants to plant cherry trees along the streets in D.C. But still, they come into obstructionism from the Army Corps of Engineers. They won't budge. Well, then, big development occurs in 1909 when William Howard Taft and his wife came to the White House. So Helen Taft was a musician by training. They had both lived in the Philippines when he was a civil governor out there. There was a park along the river that she loved because it was a place where they had a couple of bandstands and there was a big oval drive. And every evening, people from all walks of life would come and gather at this place along the river and listen to concerts. She gets the idea, hey, let's do this in Washington. So she's in the White House only 1 month. She decides she's going to create this beautification project in Potomac Park. So she orders a bandstand to be built. Well, the word gets out that she's doing this. So Eliza Sidmore realizes this is an opportunity to maybe get her cherry trees planted. She writes a note to Mrs. Taft asking for her support to include some cherry trees along the river. Mrs. Taft jumped on the idea. 2 days later, she wrote back to Eliza saying, what'd she say? I've taken up the idea and am promised the trees. She's already talking this over with her gardener. She has ordered them to track down cherry trees at nurseries in America, and they were able to find about 80 trees or so, which were brought to D.C. but actually did not last. But in the meantime, almost overnight, this project escalated hugely because of Eliza Sidmore's connections to some very high-level Japanese officials. Two men are traveling in Washington for social events. This is one of them, Jokichi Takamine. He's probably the most important Japanese person in America at the time. He was the person who isolated the hormone, adrenaline, which led to epinephrine. Very, very successful man, had several chemical patents, very wealthy, lived on Riverside Drive in New York City. He comes to Washington for some social events with the consul general from Japan in New York. Eliza Sidmore runs into them at this event, tells him about Mrs. Taft's idea. He says to her, Takamine, will you find out if Mrs. Taft will accept a donation of 2,000 trees for her project? One of the original documents that I have in my book that I haven't seen published elsewhere, I found during my research in Japan. It was a letter she writes to the Consul General, Dear Mr. Mizuno, I met with Mrs. Taft this afternoon. She will be happy to accept the gift of the trees for her Mukojima. So they decided, Takamine and the consul, that it would be better for those trees to come as a gift from Japan, from the city of Tokyo to the city of Washington, D.C., for diplomatic reasons. So that is what happened. They sent those trees. They arrived. They were due to arrive in the spring of 1910. This is another letter that kind of confirms that Eliza Sidmore was a major mediary, because this is a letter she's writing to her editor. She's writing an article about the trees that are coming. She's telling her editor, I met with Mrs. Taft today. Here is the landscaping plan for the trees that will be planted in double rows around the tidal basin. But unfortunately, as you may know, those first trees arrived. The U.S. Department of Agriculture inspected them, found them diseased, full of pests, and they said, we must destroy them. They are a risk to U.S. agriculture, so that is what was done. So all 2,000 trees were destroyed. So the Japanese were very gracious about it. They agreed to send another set of trees, this time 3,000, and they assured the American officials that they would be grown under pristine conditions under the supervision of horticulturalists in Japan. So those new trees arrived in the spring of 1912. They inspected them almost overnight. They were kind of late to get here. And they put together a very quick dedication ceremony. And Mrs. Taft arranged to go down to the tidal basin to witness the planting of those first trees from Japan. She only invited 3 guests. Those were the Japanese ambassador and his wife and Eliza Sidmore. So she was in her 50s when she stood alongside Mrs. Taft and watched the planting of those trees that she had tried for, by then, around 30 years to have imported to Washington. So those are the trees that we know today. About 1,800 of them were planted around the tidal basin. Most have been replaced over the years, but what is really interesting is that they really were planted in these double rows, and they really are, the experience they create is very much like the experience that people had in Japan. So what happened to Eliza Scidmore? She, late in life, moved to Geneva, Switzerland. She was living there she became a peace advocate, an international peace advocate. She was even given an honorary doctorate from George Washington University in 1919 for her work in promoting world understanding. And she became a fan of the League of Nations. She moved to Geneva, Switzerland in the 1920s, and she died there in 1929 after an emergency appendectomy. So her ashes were taken to Japan, and she was interred at the same grave site as her mother and her brother. So I visited the site when I was there in 2013. The Japanese still go to her grave site twice a year, in the springtime when the trees are in bloom, and at the anniversary of her death, to pay tribute to her as a friend of Japan. So I'm going to stop there. This is my book. This is the first biography of her. It came out 2 years ago, and it really intertwines her biographical story and the story of the trees. So if you're interested, it is available. I don't like to send people to Amazon because they're not very good to authors, but they really do have it at a good price right now. So I'll tell you, it's 30% off the publisher price. So if you're interested in the book, do check it out, and Amazon is a good source. So with that, I'm going to end and take questions.
Here's some time for some questions or comments. We need a runner. Where are the ushers?
Since Ms. Skidmore traveled to many countries and wrote about them, was she fluent in the foreign languages, especially Japanese?
I've never been able to find evidence how fluent she was in the language. She obviously knew some Japanese, and also she would have been traveling at different times with interpreters. I did find some instances where she's talking about being accompanied by some of the locals. For example, China. Big shock in the story is that it turns out she was an incredible traveler to China, and she talks about hiring people along the way.
Is this working? Yes. I understood that the first shipment of trees were quite large. They were well developed, and the second were smaller, and that made some sense in terms of the bugs.
That's a good point, because the first batch of trees that were sent apparently were mature trees. And the thought was apparently that if they sent mature trees, they would be more magnificent when they bloomed. But the problem was that they were old trees, which meant that they were infested with pests and some with diseases. So the second batch were really, they went back, they took grafts of the trees, and they used, pristine conditions, the soil, the grafting process to create these saplings. So the second batch that was sent were indeed much younger and much more able to withstand the transplant.
There's a question in the back.
I lived in Japan where I taught a half an hour from Hiroshima. And several times I visited the epicenter of Hiroshima, where there were many cherry trees, apple blossoms along the river, where elementary school children put cranes on the trees, which was spectacular. And I also have what may, if I may editorialize, an interesting story about the culture of Japan. I came from Boston to here, to Asbury. And while there, I visited the Kennedy Museum on the river. And among the displays was a letter written by the Japanese captain of the destroyer that sank Kennedy's PT boat, congratulating him on his presidency. And all the shipmates of that Japanese destroyer signed it. That to me was an interesting story of the culture after the war.
There's an interesting thing about the cherry trees. I've already mentioned how I've given you the history of the cherry trees dating back for thousands of years in Japan. Cherry blossoms became a very important part of Japanese national identity. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because during World War II, they were actually painted onto the wings of the fuselage of the kamikaze ships. Before they would take the planes, before they would take off, Japanese people would come out, wave boughs, branches of Japanese cherry blossoms as these young kamikaze pilots were sailing off, to their deaths. And so cherry blossoms have been both a symbol of beauty in Japan, and also they have a concept that's called mono no awari. It is from Buddhism, I believe, and it means the pathos of things. And really, it is all about how when we see the cherry blossoms, we have a feeling we feel their glory, and we also feel the tragedy of them because that glory is so short-lived. So this is a very, very important concept in Japanese culture. And so cherry blossoms have been a very important symbol in Japanese history, in part for this reason. Thank you.
So you may have noticed I've grown a little bit.